Good morning, River Life Church. It's a pleasure having you here with us. I'm Kong. I'm the associate pastor, and again, great to have you with us. Today, we're going to take some time to reflect on the past year with COVID. Can you believe it? We've been in this pandemic for a little over a year, and while it finally feels like we're making our way out of it, some of us are getting vaccinated. Some of us, are receiving our first vaccines or about to receive our first vaccines. While some of us have already received our second vaccines, there's still a lingering uncertainty of what's to come and what life will continue to look like. Yesterday, I was at Target grocery shopping, and while we were checking out, I noticed there was a couple who didn't wear a mask, and in this world of wearing masks, it came upon my mind was like, I wonder why this guy wasn't wearing a mask. Like why isn't he being safe? But I was like, well, he's got whatever he holds on to. That's fine. I'm okay. Wearing a mask. If he's fine not wearing a mask, that's okay. And then as we were checking out, there's another customer who passed him, and they exchanged a few words that were not very pleasant with each other about wearing masks. And so the uncertainty of what life looks like, even in the midst of receiving COVID vaccines, is still very uncertain. And so we want to take some time to reflect, to contemplate, to think about how we've all been impacted. Again, we've been in this for a year, and it's changed our lives in the smallest of ways to the biggest of ways. And with Mother's Day coming up next week, and Father's Day coming up in a month, we've all been affected different ways. For some of us, last year might have been the first time where we didn't get a chance to celebrate these holidays, these celebrations, these traditions in a normal way. And for some of us, we've tragically lost our mothers and our fathers, or a motherly figure, or a fatherly figure. And so as this Mother's Day comes up, this Father's Day comes up, the future holiday comes up, the rest of life comes up, there's an uncertainty, there's a cautiousness, there's a wondering of what this will look like. And for many of us, there might be a desire to return to what's normal. And for some of us, there's a realization of there will be a new normal. Some of us might be even wondering, where has God been through all of this? Why would a good God let something like COVID happen? Couldn't God just eliminate COVID? What has God been doing during COVID? Now, if these are some of the questions that have come to mind, I think that's absolutely okay to have. I'm glad that you're here with us this morning to wrestle through some of these thoughts that we might all have, we might all share. And while I may not have any answers that will be helpful, I know we can always turn to the Bible for something that is helpful. And so today we're going to be in the book of James. And James offers us a solution to this uncertainty that we can relate to. And so we're going to be in James chapter 4, verses 13 through 16. And so if you've got your app on your phone, if you've got your Bible, feel free to follow along. I'm going to be reading from James chapter 4, verse 13 through 16 in the New Living Translation. The verse will also be put on screen here as well as on screen for our online congregation. And so let's read James 4, verse 13 through 16. This is what it says. Look here, you who say, today or tomorrow we are going to a certain town and will stay there a year. We will do business there and make a profit. How do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's here a little while, then it's gone. What you ought to say is, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. Otherwise, you are boasting about your own pretentious plans, and all such boasting is evil. The author of this letter is James, and James was the half-brother of Jesus. When Jesus started his ministry, James didn't believe in Jesus. James doubted Jesus. James probably thought Jesus was crazy. That's my crazy half-brother. I don't know what happened to him. But after Jesus died, James was a pillar in the early church. He was one of the crucial leaders of the early church. And so he writes this letter to address believers that they need to practice what they preach. They need to practice what they believe in. The issue that James encountered with the church that he wrote to specifically was that some would identify themselves as Christ followers, as believers, as Christians, but their actions were non-existent. James' main point throughout his letter, which is about 5 chapters long, is that believers that have a real faith in Jesus, that leads them to act upon their beliefs. And then James questions that if you have real faith in Jesus, but if you don't have actions that are coming out from that real belief, you might not have any belief at all. And so James ties in this idea of you have to have faith and actions together to demonstrate that you have a real relationship with Jesus. And so in the passage that we just read, James addresses specifically business people who are well off and they're planning for business trips to make more money. So these business people, they are Christians. They say they believe in Jesus. But James had an issue with them because what happened was they were planning a year ahead for their business. Now, there's nothing wrong about planning ahead. So if you're a business person or if you've got a little gig or a side hustle that you like to do, there's no problem in planning, okay, what's the next week going to look like? What's the next month going to look like? What's the next year going to look like? That's absolutely okay. But the intentions and the attitude and the behavior and the inner desires of these business people was James' concern. You see, their desire to make money, their desire to plan ahead, that became priority. That became everything. That preceded everything, including God. And so James' concern was that, whoa, hold on, business people. It's okay for you to plan ahead. It's okay for you to take into consideration how much you're going to make in a year. But are you thinking about just yourself? Or are you taking into consideration that in believing in God, should God shape how you're thinking about the next year to come? Should you take into consideration how believing in Jesus should shape what making money looks like? So their attitude was an attitude of arrogance and certainty, knowing that they would make it through the year and be prosperous. And they dismissed anything about God's sovereignty, about God's presence, about God, about their relationship with Jesus. Being prosperous was their priority. And again, that came before devotion to God. And so in verse 16, James informs us that the issue was rooted in the believers boasting about their pretentious and hollow plans. I had to look up pretentious to see what it meant. It means that they had hollow plans, that they were exaggerating, they were arrogant. It's like me, like confidently standing here saying, I'm going to be a millionaire next year. There's no way that's going to happen. There's no way I can guarantee that. There's no way that any of that may come true, especially during COVID, because we know that people who've had COVID, some of them made it through, and unfortunately some of them had it, some of them don't. And so their exaggeration was filled with a sense of, I am certain that I can control my future. I am certain that I am going to make it through the year. I am certain that I am going to make a lot of money because it's all about me. So James brings up in verse 14 this issue that people have no idea or maybe no realization or forget about it. But then James reminds the people he's writing to, the business people, this, that their lives are like the morning fog. It's here a little while, then it's gone. In some translations, James says your life is like a mist. You've got a spray bottle and you spray a mist. All those little droplets are gone within seconds. Now, James isn't saying that our life is insignificant. That's not what he means. Rather, that our life is precious and that we have no control over our lives, regardless of how hard we try, how hard we think, how much we desire it. We have no control over it. James brings up a point that nothing is certain in life, that our lives can be altered in a moment's notice, like what we've all experienced this past year. I still remember about a year ago as we were talking in the office, Pastor Greg, Tommy, and I, we were in the office. It was Friday evening, and we were like, what should service look like? And we were anticipating that the governor was going to come out with the first, at that point, it was the first quarantine order, or the first shelter-in-place order. And we were anticipating that day of, okay, this is what service is going to look like. We're going to have masks, and we're going to ask people to sit, 6 feet apart, and we were organized everything. And then around noontime, the governor came on. The governor's like, we're going to have shelter in place. Stay home for the next 2 weeks. Don't go anywhere. Don't travel. And all that morning that we were prepping, we were like, well, there goes our morning. And so Pastor Greg got on the computer, and he's like, okay, no more service for the foreseeable future. We're going to be online. Nothing is permanent. Our lives on earth is temporary. So what's the solution to this approach of life's uncertainty? James offers a way. He redirects us by saying this in verse 15. He says this to the business people and the recipients of the letter. This is what he says. What you ought to say is, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. James takes their thought of being so confident about their future and reorients them and reminds them that God is in control. That God is in control. James offers to the believers that they need God to shape their attitudes towards their business, their wealth, their desires, their futures. Believers need to take into consideration who God is and what God desires. Believers can't carry their business, whether it's, again, their literal business or just, business like our everyday business, our everyday grind, our routines. We can't carry our business just like how any other person does. But that in it, we need to see God's plan and what God wants us to do. And we can summarize this with the greatest commandment. Jesus tells us the greatest commandment is to love God and to love others. And so every day we go about our lives and we have to take into consideration, how am I loving God this moment? How am I loving others this moment? James tells us that we can think that the things we want to happen may be certain, but we have no control over any of these desires. And so when we project the certainty over things that we have no control over, it puts us in a place where we disregard God. And that's what the business people that James was addressing was getting to, that they were disregarding God in all of this. And that is evil because in disregarding God, in a sense, we're making ourselves God in saying that, we're certain about this. We're guaranteeing that. And so again, James is reminding us, no, you can't be certain about that. Because the only thing that's certain is God. So here's the takeaway for this morning. If you leave out of here and forget everything, I want you to remember this. That God is certain when we are uncertain. That God is certain when we are uncertain. And throughout the entire Bible, there are many places that shares with us how God is certain. I'm just going to share 5 places for us this morning. In Revelation chapter 21, verse 6, God is above all the things and before all things. He is the beginning and the end. He is immortal and he is present everywhere so that everyone can know him. Colossians chapter 1, verse 16. God created all things and holds all things together, both in heaven and in earth, both the visible and the invisible. Romans chapter 11, verse 33. God knows everything. He knows all things past, all things present, all things future. And there is no limit to his knowledge. God knows everything completely, even before it happens. And then Jeremiah 32, verse 17. God can do all things and accomplish all things. Nothing is too difficult for God. And then lastly, in Psalm chapter 103, verse 19, God is in control of all things and he rules over all things. He has power and authority over nature, earthly kings, history, angels, and even demons. Even Satan himself has to ask God's permission before he can act. And so in a place where things are uncertain, when we are uncertain, we can trust that God is certain. So what does that look like for you and I this morning? To trust in God's certainty when everything feels uncertain. I think there's 2 groups that we can fall into, and these aren't the only 2 groups, but I think there's 2 groups that we can fall into. First, some of us are just plain sick and tired of feeling uncertain. COVID has limited what we can do. It's taken away what we've known to be life and to be regular and to be normal. And so as it feels like we're taking steps to get out of this, to get out of this pandemic, we've begun to plan ways to break free from this uncertainty. We're planning to find ways to experience life like how it was. We're going out. We're being with friends and family. We're going out to eat in the restaurants. We're planning vacations. And that's absolutely okay. But like the business people that James was talking about, we need to take in consideration what James says to the church. Are we doing it in a way that's mindful of who God is? Or are we just simply giving the excuse to do whatever we want because we owe it to ourselves? It's okay to enjoy time. It's okay to experience leisure time and, again, to be at the restaurants and to be vacationing. At the same time, at the forefront, how are we loving God in doing it? How are we loving others in doing it? So I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying as you do, at the forefront, how are you loving God? How are you loving others? If loving God and loving our neighbors is not an equation, we need to take into consideration how that can be prioritized. Now, secondly, some of us still feel uncertain, still feel cautious about COVID and how we've been impacted by the pandemic. And ironically, I wonder if some of us have become certain of uncertainty. Kind of an ironic thought, but I wonder if some of us have become certain of uncertainty. And so have we gotten to the point where we're still overly cautious about everything, causing all of those plans of being overly cautious to be focused on us and not God? And so in a weird way, in an odd way, our uncertainty of what we've experienced in the pandemic in a weird way, that might cause us to be uncertain in the next few weeks, in the next few months, in the next few years of how COVID has impacted us. And so it's okay to be COVID cautious. It's okay not wanting to go in the restaurants yet, or to be with family and friends yet, or to take vacations yet. Absolutely okay. But in us being COVID cautious and in being certain about uncertainty, how are we loving God and loving others in that as well? So that's not just focused on us. Regardless of where we land, we're ready to break out of this funk, or we're still overly cautious. We've been through a lot this year. And again, we're still not fully sure what the rest of the year looks like. And on the spectrum, some of us might be ready to just again live life like how it was, or to experience life in a new way, while other of us are, no, not yet. So wherever we land, that's okay. But I wanted us to take some time to create space for us, to just reflect on what we've been through and what we've gone through, and to reflect on so much that has happened. We've lost people that we've cared for. We've lost them physically due to COVID. We've experienced ambiguous loss with annual traditions, with life celebrations. And so I wanted to create a space for us this morning to take some time and just reflect, maybe mourn, maybe grieve, maybe even be angry of what we've all experienced this past year, because it's been a lot. And I also want to take into consideration what our country, our world has all experienced. And so you might have been wondering as you walked in, why are the Christmas lights up? Well, it's not Christmas, it's May. But I want to give you an idea of what we experienced and the weight and the impact that we've felt that we might not have been able to put to words or seen. In the U.S., COVID losses have tallied up to 576,000 deaths, and that's the U.S. alone. Now, if we break that down, that's the entire Ramsey County population right there. So if you live in St. Paul, Roseville, Maplewood, Shoreview, New Brighton, Arden Hills, North St. Paul, Venice Heights, Little Canada, Mounds View, Falcon Heights, North Oaks, Lauderdale, and Gem Lake, that's 576,000 people total. That would probably be most of us in this room right here. That's the weight of COVID, what we felt in terms of just the physical loss in the U.S. If we were to spend a second to honor every one of these lives taken by COVID, it would take us a little over 6.5 days to honor all 576,000 individuals. So say if we were to give a moment of silence, a second for every individual who's died because of COVID, we would literally be in our seats here until next Sunday. That's how long it would take, just to give each one of those person a second. Now in this room, we've got about 3,400 lights hung up. These strands up here in this light canopy and behind me, about 3,400 lights total. This doesn't even represent 1% of the loss that we've had. It's actually half of 1%. And so if you take a look at one light up in the canopy behind me, each light represents about 170 people who've passed away from COVID in the U.S. And so take a look at the lights that are hung up above you, lights behind me. And when James mentions to the church, he writes to that our life is like a morning fog, like a mist. That's how precious life is. that with our lights hung up, one light, it's 170 lives right there. That's how staggering it is. That's what we've been through, knowingly or unknowingly. And so again, some of us have lost people in our lives that we're still grieving for, mourning for. Some of us experience ambiguous loss. Again, whether those be life celebrations, like a birth, graduation, marriage, while others have lost out on annual traditions like family reunions, anniversaries, birthdays, vacations, holidays. It's okay to sit in that. It's okay to mourn in that. So I'm going to give us a moment to reflect, mourn, grieve, whatever it is that you need to get out of you. Give us some time to sit in that for a little bit, knowing that we've faced a lot of uncertainty. We're going to have some music in the background, and so do what you need to. Take this moment, again, to do what you have to. And then once the music is done, we'll play a video reminding us that God is certain, even in the midst of uncertainty. So take a few minutes and use this time as needed.